All right, welcome back. In this video, let's take a look at some of the attachments that we have available. Now, depending on the tool, you might have a ton of attachments. You might have a tool that doesn't have a lot of attachments. I think now, for the most part, they're fairly standard. I have some ones that are generally not available that are usable on some of my other more advanced tools. In particular, this is kind of like the grasp and scraping type of tool. But most of them are going to fall kind of in this standard, these usually black attachments that you get with some kind of, modern percussor that's generally consumer friendly. So when we look at these different tools, it's very easy to get confused and overwhelmed trying to figure out which tool you want to use on each area. But I can give you some simple rules for this. There is a bit of experimentation that's necessary for this. So you will find generally that certain tools feel better in certain areas of the body. Probably a number of reasons for this. Number one is the contour of the area that you're working on. So some areas are a little bit more bony. It's hard to use something that is a little bit more rigid of an attachment versus other body parts that can take more pressure, like thinking about the IT band area or the quadricep, and you can use a variety of different attachments. Some of those things will make a big difference. So let's just start with the kind of the general ball here seems to work for most areas. Although, again, depending on the area that you're looking to work, that there's not a lot of flexibility with this. Some of these ball attachments are very soft, some of them are a lot harder, but for general application, this ball does pretty well. And so if I flip it on here, and again, not only is it the attachment, but also the speed that you're working at makes a big difference too. So if you're working very fast, a lot of times you're working generally pretty superficially. If you're working slow, you're going to work on one area more, so that's going to influence the head or the attachment that you're going to use. So if I work this area, for example, I'm fairly light with it. I start to push in. It has a pretty good feel to it, although it can get kind of sharp if I start to push down in there around certain bony areas. But this one generally has, in my opinion, the greatest degree of flexibility in terms of areas that you can work. So I like to use it on neck, back, or if somebody's quite sensitive, it's probably my first go-to. Let's talk about some of these other ones. This one in particular has a rounded curvature to it, and this works really well for areas where I was talking about where there's a lot of tissue and it can sink in pretty well, but generally an area, in my opinion, that's more flat. Okay, so this tends to work really well on the quadricep. It works really well on the IT band. And another area that this works extremely well on, this kind of curved attachment, is on the plantar surface of the foot, because the foot has that natural kind of bevel to it. Okay, so when you run this over there, it feels really, really good. So I will use this type of attachment on the bottom of the foot. What else do we have here? So some companies come up with these kind of odd shapes, which are real interesting, like this rounded one that has a little smaller area that's pinpointed at the top. So I've tried this on multiple areas, and I think that it's very similar in application to just a pure flat head like this. They're not vastly different because a lot of areas you don't have enough nerve receptors in an area to basically tell the difference between the two. But I guess it depends on where you're working. I don't honestly use this one a whole lot. Brings us to this one, which is this more just kind of short, flat head. Okay, and again, this one has a nice rounded application to it, very similar to this one. I actually find this one to be a little bit more comfortable than this one, because the way that it disperses the force on that one is different than hitting something flat with a flat surface. Okay, you will feel the difference in what I'm talking about when you start to experiment with it. But this one here works really well for a wide variety of things. Forearms, biceps, works really well on the trapezius. You could use it on the pecs and so forth. So this is one that's just kind of like a universal go-to as well, next to this ball. What I do like is that some attachments, I don't have it with me right now, will actually have an applicator that goes over the top of this, which seems to kind of disperse the force just a little bit and softens it so it's more comfortable. And that way you can put that applicator on top of that for areas that are quite sensitive, especially if you don't have a lot of attachments to tinker with. Okay, so I'm going to put that one over here. What else do we have? You may have this one. This is kind of a new kid on the block. Some devices have this, some don't. It's flat, okay, and wide, and this application is very interesting. I've played with this one as well quite a bit. The challenge that I find with this one is that if it's not used in the right area, it's very uncomfortable, okay? So, but it's used more in this kind of gliding technique, okay? Because it's so wide, it's gonna hit more receptors across the skin. So this is an interesting point that I wanna make, is that the amount of density of nerve receptors you have in an area depends upon where it is. So if we look at the amount of nerve receptors that we have per square millimeter in the finger, we have a lot. Versus, for example, on the forearm, they're more spaced out. And then we talk about something like the thigh, the quadricep, they're even more spaced out, okay? So the more nerve receptors we have per area, the more you're gonna use probably more specific types of heads like this one, or maybe even, again, you know, this sort of application here, or in this one, that's more of an advanced version, which is something that's very pinpointed. Something like this I would use into the hand or in between the fingers. Okay, because it's so small and it's going to hit an area that's really rich in nerve receptors per square millimeter. Okay, so when we use something like this, we're probably going to use this on a larger muscle group. We're going to use it on quadriceps. We're going to use this on hamstrings. May use it on the glutes. That might be an application. But when we do this, I want to make sure that you know I would not put it down at a 90-degree angle to the tissue. It's not going to feel good, especially in areas where there's a lot of resting muscle tone. You're going to feel the device is actually bouncing versus the percussion waves going into the tissue. So I'd always be running at an angle to the tissue and gliding more superficially than trying to dig into the tissue, which we've talked about, which I don't recommend anyway because that's not the intention of the tools. Okay. Now another popular one, actually I want to get to this one first. This one is a little bit more rare, and when I looked at this, it looked really goofy when I first saw it. But I've actually come to be to really enjoy using this one. It's becoming one of my favorites. So it actually looks like a thumb, okay, which is pretty inventive. So it's about the size of my thumb, which is kind of interesting. And I was like wondering, where are you going to use this? And actually the best place that I found to use this on is on the TFL, okay? So it works really well up here on the side of the pelvis. TFL area responds really well to it, and toward the lateral portion of the IT band. I do find that it is quite aggressive on other areas where we have rich in a lot of nerve sensors. It doesn't feel amazing on the trap area, again, because we want to have a wider applicator. This feels kind of intense in this area. But you could try it out on a number of different spots if you want to be real specific. But again, as I talked about, the size of the head of the applicator makes a difference on comfort. Something that's more specific and using it in certain areas, ooh, it gets pretty intense. Okay. Now the last one I want to talk about here is this fork option, and I get a lot of questions on this one and what this one is actually used for. You could use it for a lot of things. For the most part, there's a gap here in the middle, so when you put this on the skin on most areas, you're not going to be able to perceive the gap here in the middle. It's going to feel like a flat applicator, essentially like this one. Okay. So when I turn that one on, and for example, if I put it here, it just feels like both of them are making contact at the same time. They don't alternate, okay? So it doesn't feel dramatically different, like I said, than that flathead piece. What this was ultimately made for, and anybody out there can correct me if I'm wrong, but is to move up and down the vertebrae. So if this is my spine, one of those goes on each side of the spine and we work up and down. There are other tools that are made for that type of application, you know, such as this device, okay? So, but this is done for the percussion variety. The only thing I'm going to caution you with on this one is, again, because you're working, if you are going to work on the sides of the spine, don't run into the vertebrae. The spinous process is in the middle, so people tend to roll right over that thing. It's very painful and can potentially damage tissue, if not the vertebrae. So you need to be very careful if you're going to do something like that. Okay, and make sure you watch instructional videos for that as well. But when we do that, it's very superficial. You're not digging into the vertebrae with the intention to mobilize it or anything else like that. So it's done very lightly. I don't recommend that most people do these types of techniques themselves on areas like the neck. Just far too sensitive. If you're working with a professional that knows what they're doing, then that's a different story. But I wouldn't be, again, spending too much time on spinal mobilization with these tools. I would mostly use them on soft tissues around the area, okay? So those are your main tools and applications for this. I won't review too many of these other ones because these are more on these professional percussion models. but essentially they're the same thing, lots of different ones. Actually, that one's nice, it has a roller on it. Although again, you find that most of these applications will get the job done without having something super specific like this. So I hope that helps. There's a little bit of playfulness that comes with using these things and trying different spots of the body out and seeing how they respond, but you're going to find your favorite tools for each area, and they don't have to be one or the other. What really matters is that you're applying the tool that gets you the best results and optimizes the response of your nervous system to the therapeutic protocol.